The imperial palace of Ming China functioned not only as the residence of the emperor, but as a highly regulated administrative institution governed by ritual hierarchy, surveillance, and codified discipline. Within this enclosed world, the lives of imperial consorts and concubines were shaped by an intricate system of rank, obligation, and restriction. Historical records indicate that the palace was structured to maintain absolute order around the emperor's authority, and any deviation from prescribed conduct was treated as a disruption of both political stability and moral orthodoxy. Concubines, despite their proximity to imperial power, occupied a position defined less by privilege than by vulnerability to institutional control. The Ming dynasty inherited and expanded earlier imperial household regulations, formalizing them through court statutes, palace memorials, and administrative manuals. Surviving documents suggest that the palace hierarchy among women was meticulously organized, with empresses, imperial consorts, and lower-ranking concubines placed within a rigid ranking system that dictated residence, material allowances, and access to the emperor. This hierarchy was not merely ceremonial. It functioned as a mechanism of governance designed to prevent rivalry from destabilizing the succession and to ensure that the emperor's household reflected Confucian ideals of propriety and obedience. Concubines entered the palace through a selection process overseen by court officials and senior palace women. Contemporary accounts describe how young women were examined for physical health, family background, and perceived moral character before being assigned a rank. Once admitted, they were effectively separated from their natal families and placed under the supervision of palace administrators and eunuchs. Legal codes of the period reveal that their movement, communication, and even interpersonal relationships were subject to strict regulation, reinforcing the palace's function as a controlled political environment rather than a private domestic space. The expectation of obedience extended beyond etiquette into matters of daily conduct. Palace regulations dictated waking routines, dress protocols, ceremonial participation, and even emotional expression during court rituals. Chroniclers noted that concubines were expected to embody restraint, humility, and loyalty, qualities considered essential for maintaining harmony within the imperial household. Defiance of these expectations, whether through interpersonal conflict, attempts to influence political decisions, or violations of seclusion rules, was interpreted not as a personal failing alone, but as a threat to institutional discipline. Mechanisms of surveillance played a central role in enforcing palace law. Eunuchs and senior palace women acted as intermediaries between the emperor and the inner court, reporting irregularities and overseeing adherence to protocol. Surviving palace regulations suggest that the spatial arrangement of residences facilitated observation, with living quarters organized in ways that limited privacy and encouraged accountability. Written reports, testimony from attendants, and collective responsibility within palace units contributed to an environment in which misconduct was difficult to conceal. Punishments imposed on concubines who defied palace law varied depending on the nature of the offense, the concubine's rank, and the broader political context. Historical records indicate that disciplinary measures often began with formal reprimands or demotion. A reduction in rank carried significant consequences, including relocation to less favorable quarters, loss of servants, and diminished ceremonial status. Such penalties reinforced the importance of hierarchy while signaling to other palace residents the consequences of deviation. More severe infractions triggered forms of confinement. Contemporary accounts describe instances in which concubines were restricted to their quarters or transferred to isolated palace sections under supervised residence. This form of punishment served both disciplinary and preventive purposes, limiting the individual's capacity to form alliances or influence palace dynamics. Surviving documents suggest that confinement could be indefinite, with release contingent upon imperial approval or the intervention of senior palace authorities. In certain cases, punishment extended to corporal measures administered under bureaucratic oversight. Legal codes of the Ming period reveal that while high-ranking consorts were often shielded from physical punishment due to concerns about imperial dignity, lower-ranking concubines could be subjected to regulated disciplinary beatings. These measures were typically carried out by palace staff rather than public judicial authorities, reflecting the palace's semi-autonomous legal sphere. The existence of such punishments underscores the dual identity of concubines as both members of the imperial household and subjects of internal administrative law. Another significant form of discipline involved forced labor and reassignment. Historical records indicate that concubines who violated palace rules could be transferred to service roles involving textile production, ritual preparation, or maintenance tasks normally performed by lower-status palace women. This reassignment functioned as both punishment and social demotion, symbolically reinforcing the link between obedience and status within the palace hierarchy. Chroniclers noted that such measures also reduced the individual's visibility within court life, diminishing any potential political influence. Accusations related to factionalism or attempts to interfere with succession carried particularly serious consequences. Surviving documents suggest that the Ming court was deeply concerned with maintaining clarity in imperial lineage and preventing rival maternal networks from emerging. Concubines suspected of forming alliances or engaging in intrigue could face investigation by eunuch officials and, in extreme cases, removal from the palace. Removal did not necessarily imply execution. It could involve forced retirement to peripheral palace compounds or religious institutions, effectively ending the individual's participation in court life. The role of eunuchs in disciplinary procedures was complex and often controversial. Contemporary sources describe eunuchs as both enforcers of imperial will and participants in palace factionalism. Their responsibility for reporting misconduct placed them in positions of significant influence over the lives of concubines. Historical records indicate that accusations conveyed through eunuch channels could shape imperial perception, highlighting the asymmetrical power dynamics within the inner court. At the same time, imperial edicts periodically attempted to regulate eunuch authority, reflecting ongoing concerns about the balance of power within palace administration. Emperors themselves varied in their involvement with disciplinary matters. Some rulers delegated enforcement to palace officials, while others issued direct orders in response to reported infractions. Surviving memorials suggest that imperial decisions were often influenced by broader political considerations, including the stability of succession and the reputation of the court. Punishment of a concubine could therefore carry symbolic significance beyond the individual case, serving as a demonstration of the emperor's commitment to order and moral governance. The psychological dimensions of palace discipline were also significant, though less explicitly documented. Contemporary writings imply that the threat of demotion, isolation, or loss of imperial favor functioned as a powerful mechanism of control. Concubines operated within an environment where status was fragile and dependent on adherence to expectations, creating conditions of heightened caution and self-regulation. This atmosphere aligned with Confucian principles emphasizing hierarchy and moral discipline as foundations of political stability. Religious and ritual frameworks sometimes intersected with disciplinary practices. Historical records indicate that concubines undergoing punishment could be required to participate in acts of ritual repentance or be temporarily excluded from ceremonial events. Such measures reinforced the moral dimension of palace law, framing obedience not only as administrative necessity but as ethical obligation. Chroniclers noted that ritual exclusion carried profound symbolic weight within a court culture deeply invested in ceremonial order. Long-term consequences of punishment often extended beyond the immediate disciplinary action. Surviving documents suggest that a concubine's reputation within palace records could influence future treatment, access to imperial audiences, and the prospects of any children she bore. The interconnection between maternal status and imperial succession meant that disciplinary histories could shape broader political trajectories, illustrating the extent to which personal conduct within the palace was inseparable from state governance. The Ming palace punishment system therefore functioned as a multifaceted structure combining administrative regulation, moral ideology, and political calculation. Concubines who defied palace law encountered a spectrum of responses designed to restore order, deter imitation, and preserve hierarchical clarity. Historical records consistently emphasize that these measures were not arbitrary, but embedded within a bureaucratic framework that mirrored the governance of the empire itself. Within this controlled environment, the lives of concubines reflected the paradox of proximity to power without autonomy. Their experiences reveal how the imperial household operated as a microcosm of Ming political philosophy, where discipline, hierarchy, and ritual were deployed to sustain authority and continuity. Surviving accounts, though often filtered through official perspectives, provide insight into the mechanisms through which the palace maintained stability while managing the tensions inherent in a densely populated and politically sensitive inner court. The enforcement of punishment against concubines who defied palace law thus illustrates broader patterns of Ming governance, highlighting the integration of domestic regulation with imperial statecraft. As contemporary observers noted, order within the palace was understood as inseparable from order within the empire, and the discipline imposed on individuals within the inner court was viewed as a necessary component of maintaining the legitimacy and continuity of imperial rule. Surviving palace case records and court chronicles suggest that disciplinary enforcement within the Ming inner court was rarely impulsive. Investigations into alleged misconduct typically followed a bureaucratic process shaped by testimony, hierarchical reporting, and imperial discretion. When accusations emerged, they were often first documented by supervising palace women or eunuchs responsible for maintaining order within specific residential compounds. These reports could then be forwarded through administrative channels, allowing senior eunuchs or court officials assigned to the inner palace to evaluate the credibility of the claim before presenting it to the emperor or to high-ranking consorts entrusted with supervisory authority. This investigative process reflected the broader administrative culture of the Ming state, which emphasized documentation, accountability, and hierarchical verification. Contemporary accounts describe how written memorials and oral testimony were used to reconstruct incidents involving violations of palace law, including breaches of etiquette, unauthorized communication, or interpersonal conflict that threatened the hierarchy of the harem. The reliance on recorded testimony served both as a disciplinary mechanism and as a protective measure, ensuring that punishment could be justified within the framework of imperial governance rather than perceived as arbitrary personal retaliation. The degree of punishment imposed often depended on the perceived intent behind the violation. Historical records indicate that minor infractions, such as failure to observe ceremonial protocol or disputes among palace residents, were frequently resolved through admonitions delivered by senior palace women. These admonitions carried institutional authority, functioning as formal warnings that were entered into palace records. Chroniclers noted that repeated warnings could accumulate, shaping administrative perceptions of a concubine's reliability and influencing future decisions regarding rank or privileges. More serious violations, particularly those interpreted as attempts to manipulate imperial favor or disrupt internal harmony, triggered a broader response. Surviving documents suggest that concubines suspected of forming unauthorized alliances or spreading rumors were subject to interrogation conducted within the palace rather than through external judicial institutions. The palace's semi-autonomous legal status allowed disciplinary matters to be resolved internally, reflecting the perception that the imperial household constituted a distinct political domain requiring specialized governance. Confinement remained one of the most frequently documented punitive measures for significant infractions. Contemporary sources describe how concubines placed under confinement were often relocated to designated quarters where interaction with other residents was tightly restricted. Eunuch supervision ensured that communication channels were limited, and attendants assigned to the confined individual were selected for loyalty and discretion. This form of isolation functioned as both punishment and preventative strategy, reducing the potential for continued influence while allowing the individual to remain under palace jurisdiction. Demotion, when combined with confinement, created long-lasting consequences that extended beyond immediate disciplinary goals. Historical records indicate that a reduction in rank altered not only living arrangements but also ceremonial participation, daily routines, and material provisions. A demoted concubine might lose access to elaborate clothing, reduced numbers of attendants, and diminished opportunities for interaction with influential figures within the court. Chroniclers noted that such changes reinforced visible reminders of hierarchical discipline, serving as a deterrent to others within the palace environment. In some cases, disciplinary action intersected with the politics of imperial succession. The Ming court maintained acute sensitivity toward the potential for maternal influence to shape factional alignments around imperial heirs. Surviving documents suggest that concubines associated with emerging political rivalries could face scrutiny that extended beyond personal conduct. Allegations of attempting to secure advantages for a son, interfering with education or access to court officials, or engaging in covert communication with external family networks were treated with particular seriousness. Investigations into such matters often involved multiple layers of testimony and could result in severe restrictions designed to neutralize perceived political risk. Removal from the palace represented one of the most consequential punishments available short of execution. Historical records indicate that concubines judged to have committed serious violations could be transferred to peripheral palace residences, imperial mausoleum compounds, or religious institutions such as Buddhist convents. This removal effectively terminated their participation in court life, while preserving the symbolic integrity of the imperial household. Contemporary accounts describe how such transfers were framed as administrative decisions intended to restore harmony rather than as purely punitive exile, reflecting the Ming court's emphasis on maintaining ritual propriety even in disciplinary actions. Execution of concubines occurred, but appears to have been comparatively rare and heavily conditioned by political circumstances. Legal codes and historical chronicles suggest that capital punishment was typically reserved for cases involving accusations of witchcraft, attempts to harm imperial heirs, or participation in conspiracies perceived as threats to the emperor's safety. Even in these instances, the process often involved extended investigation and imperial deliberation. The rarity of execution underscores the court's preference for disciplinary measures that removed disruptive individuals without generating public scandal or destabilizing palace hierarchy. The influence of senior consorts and the empress in disciplinary matters also played a significant role. Surviving documents indicate that high-ranking women within the palace were entrusted with maintaining internal order and could recommend punishment or leniency based on their assessment of circumstances. Their involvement reflected the layered governance structure of the inner court, where authority was distributed among individuals whose status derived from both ceremonial rank and personal proximity to the emperor. Chroniclers noted that this dynamic sometimes produced tensions, particularly when disciplinary decisions intersected with factional loyalties or competition for influence. Eunuchs continued to occupy a complex position within these processes. Contemporary accounts describe instances in which eunuchs not only reported misconduct, but also participated in investigative procedures, managing confinement arrangements and overseeing the enforcement of disciplinary orders. Their administrative responsibilities provided them with intimate knowledge of palace affairs, which could shape outcomes of disciplinary cases. At the same time, imperial edicts periodically attempted to curb potential abuses of authority, illustrating persistent concerns about maintaining equilibrium between eunuch power and other palace institutions. Material deprivation functioned as another subtle yet effective punitive measure. Historical records suggest that concubines facing disciplinary action could experience reductions in stipends, limitations on luxury items, and restrictions on participation in seasonal ceremonies that provided opportunities for visibility within court life. Such measures reinforced the connection between obedience and material security, reflecting the broader Ming administrative practice of linking status with access to resources. Chroniclers observed that these deprivations often carried psychological weight equal to more overt forms of punishment, as they signaled diminished favor and uncertain prospects within the palace hierarchy. Ritual exclusion remained particularly significant within the cultural framework of the Ming court. Participation in ceremonies was central to the construction of identity and legitimacy within the imperial household, and exclusion from these events carried implications that extended beyond personal embarrassment. Surviving documents indicate that concubines undergoing disciplinary scrutiny could be barred from attending important festivals, ancestral rites, or court gatherings, effectively erasing their presence from the symbolic life of the palace. This exclusion reinforced moral narratives surrounding obedience and served as a visible demonstration of administrative control. The long-term consequences of punishment often affected familial and posthumous considerations. Historical records suggest that concubines who experienced demotion or removal faced limitations on burial honors and memorial recognition. Given the importance of ancestral rites within Ming society, such outcomes represented a profound extension of disciplinary authority beyond the individual's lifetime. Chroniclers noted that these measures reinforced the moral framework underpinning palace governance, emphasizing that adherence to hierarchy carried implications not only for present status, but for enduring familial reputation. At the same time, instances of rehabilitation reveal the flexibility within the punishment system. Surviving accounts describe cases in which concubines regained status following demonstrated compliance, intervention by influential figures, or shifts in political circumstances. This possibility of restoration aligned with Confucian ideals emphasizing moral correction and the potential for redemption through proper conduct. However, rehabilitation did not erase the memory of prior discipline, and administrative records continued to shape perceptions of reliability within the palace environment. The punishment system applied to concubines who defied palace law thus functioned as an extension of Ming bureaucratic logic into the intimate sphere of the imperial household. Through documentation, surveillance, hierarchical enforcement, and symbolic exclusion, the palace maintained a framework that balanced deterrence with the preservation of ritual order. Contemporary observers and later historians alike have noted that these mechanisms reveal the extent to which the inner court operated as a political institution governed by the same principles of hierarchy, discipline, and moral legitimacy that structured the broader imperial state. Within this environment, obedience was not merely a personal virtue, but a requirement embedded in the functioning of imperial governance. The experiences of concubines subjected to punishment illustrate how power within the Ming palace was regulated through a combination of administrative procedure and cultural expectation, producing a system in which personal conduct was inseparable from political consequence. The inner court, though physically secluded, remained deeply connected to the logic of imperial rule, and the disciplinary practices applied within it reflected enduring concerns about stability, legitimacy, and the preservation of hierarchical order. The disciplinary structures governing concubines in the Ming palace cannot be fully understood without considering their relationship to broader ideological frameworks that shaped imperial authority. Confucian political philosophy emphasized hierarchical harmony, moral self-regulation, and the maintenance of clearly defined social roles. Historical records indicate that the palace was regarded as a symbolic center of these principles, where the emperor's household served as an exemplar of ordered governance. The conduct of concubines therefore carried significance beyond the private sphere, reflecting the perceived moral integrity of imperial rule itself. Legal and ritual texts from the Ming period reveal that the inner court operated as a carefully regulated environment in which discipline was intertwined with moral education. Concubines were expected to internalize norms of humility, deference, and restraint, and disciplinary actions were often framed as corrective measures designed to restore alignment with these expectations. Surviving documents suggest that admonitory lectures delivered by senior palace women or eunuch administrators sometimes accompanied punishment, reinforcing the idea that misconduct represented a failure of moral cultivation rather than merely a procedural violation. The intersection of discipline and reputation played a central role in shaping the lived experiences of punished concubines. Contemporary accounts describe how palace records preserved details of disciplinary actions, influencing the attitudes of attendants, administrators, and other residents. A concubine associated with repeated infractions might encounter subtle forms of social isolation, reduced cooperation from palace staff, and diminished opportunities for participation in collective activities. Chroniclers noted that such reputational consequences could prove as restrictive as formal punishment, reinforcing self-surveillance within the hierarchical structure of the harem. Political instability at the imperial level often intensified the scrutiny applied to concubines. Periods marked by succession uncertainty, factional rivalry among officials, or tensions between eunuch and civil bureaucratic authority created conditions in which the inner court became a focal point of anxiety. Historical records indicate that during such times, disciplinary enforcement within the palace could become more stringent, reflecting concerns that internal disorder might be interpreted as a sign of broader imperial weakness. Investigations into alleged misconduct were sometimes expanded, and precautionary measures such as confinement or reassignment were implemented with heightened frequency. The relationship between concubines and their natal families introduced another dimension to disciplinary practice. Although concubines were physically separated from their relatives, surviving documents suggest that the court remained attentive to the potential influence of external family networks. Unauthorized communication, attempts to secure patronage for relatives, or involvement in unofficial exchanges of gifts could be interpreted as violations of palace law. Punishments associated with these offenses often aimed to sever external connections, reinforcing the expectation that loyalty to the emperor superseded all prior familial obligations. Material culture within the palace also reflected the consequences of punishment.